My family and I have always lived in a quiet part of Georgia. Not many tales come from this area, and to be honest, we're glad for it. It's a place where time seems to slow down and people live simple lives, far removed from the chaos of the outside world. But even in such peaceful surroundings, there are stories that refuse to stay hidden. This is one of those stories, a call that my cousin Bob, a local police officer, will never forget. Bob had been on the force for 5 years. Like many newcomers to law enforcement, he started his career full of hope and optimism. He wanted to make a real difference, to be the one who protected his community. And for the first few years, that's exactly what he did. But there are certain cases that change a person. Bob got one of those calls. It all started on a warm summer night, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. The call came from a house somewhere between Macon and Roberta, a location that, to the officers, seemed all but forgotten by time. The caller's voice was shaky, his words half-spoken and broken. He kept repeating the same thing. It's awful. Please come quick." The dispatch operator could barely make sense of it, but it was enough to send Bob and his partner to investigate. The house, when they arrived, looked abandoned. Its windows were cracked, and the door hung slightly ajar. The kind of place that people assumed was empty, if anyone had even thought of it at all. The man who called for help was sitting on the steps outside, his hands stuffed in his pockets. His face was twisted in a way that suggested he had seen something truly horrifying. When Bob and his partner approached him, the man was sobbing, though not in the traditional sense. His sobs were guttural, as if something deep inside him had broken. As they tried to talk to him, Bob could see that the man was barely coherent, muttering over and over again about something being awful and how it was too much. They tried to ask him what had happened, but his words were jumbled, as if his mind couldn't quite process the horror he had witnessed. His distress was palpable, and it didn't take long for Bob's instincts to kick in. This wasn't just a regular domestic disturbance or prank call. Something was terribly wrong. Bob's partner quickly radioed for backup. Meanwhile, Bob, feeling the weight of the situation, decided to enter the house. It was part of his training: investigate, assess, and act. He had been through countless emergency situations, but nothing had prepared him for what awaited inside that house. The moment Bob stepped through the door, the smell hit him. It was rancid, thick in the air, like rotting meat mixed with something far worse. It was the kind of smell that clung to your clothes and made you want to gag. The house looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. Piles of old newspapers, dirty clothes, and abandoned furniture were stacked high, leaving little room to move. The kitchen, especially, was in shambles. Pots and pans were piled nearly to the ceiling, and spoiled food covered every surface. Takeout containers were scattered across the floor, some open, some half-eaten. It was chaos frozen in time. Bob called out as procedure dictated, trying to see if anyone was inside. The silence that followed sent a chill down his spine. Even after years on the force, his heart began to race. Every noise felt amplified: the creak of the floorboards beneath his boots, the faint rustle of old papers in the air. Bob's mind was alert, his gun held ready. He carefully made his way into the living room, the smell getting worse with each step. But there was no one there. He continued down the narrow hallway, and as he neared the back of the houses, the air grew even heavier. His stomach turned, but he pushed forward. When he reached the door he suspected was the bedroom, the stench became unbearable. He had to cover his mouth and nose to avoid gagging as he slowly opened the door. What he saw inside made him freeze. On the bed lay 2 lifeless bodies. They were so pale, their skin a sickly gray, covered in flies. It was clear they had been dead for some time. But what disturbed Bob even more was the way the flies swarmed around their mouths and eyes. The sight of insects crawling in and out of their bodies was enough to make him nauseous. But Bob's sense of duty drove him forward. He had to investigate. He had to know what had happened. As he approached, Bob's stomach churned. One of the bodies was a man, the other a woman. The skin on their faces had already started to decompose, and the flies had taken full advantage. Bob could barely keep his composure as he stepped closer to the woman's body. That's when he noticed something even worse. She was holding something small. It took him a second to process what he was seeing. It was an infant, a tiny lifeless form, wrapped in the woman's arms. Bob's heart nearly stopped in his chest as he saw the horror before him. The baby's face was twisted in a grotesque way, its mouth slightly open as a large cockroach crawled out of it. That was the final straw for Bob. He rushed out of the room, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He stumbled over the threshold and fell to the steps outside, where he vomited violently. The sight of that dead baby haunted him, and he knew he'd never forget it. It wasn't until backup arrived that they were able to get a clearer picture of what had happened. The elderly man, the one who had been sitting outside the house when Bob arrived, turned out to be a former co-worker of the dead man. The two had worked together at a local peach packing company for many years. The man had gone to check on his friend when he hadn't heard from him for over a week. What he found when he entered the house, it was beyond his worst nightmares. He was the one who had found the bodies, and he had been too traumatized to speak about it. After piecing together what little information they could, the story emerged. The couple had been battling addiction for some time. The wife and husband had been prescribed painkillers for injuries, but over time, their dependency grew. They began using heroin together, their addictions spiraling out of control. Eventually, their young daughter, no more than 2 years old, had died from neglect. When the parents discovered their child's lifeless body, it pushed them both over the edge. They decided to end it all, and in their despair, they overdosed on heroin. The coroner later confirmed that both bodies contained enough heroin to kill them multiple times over. Bob still serves on the force today, but that night changed him. After the call, he started drinking more than he ever had. The haunting image of the baby's face never left him. He sought therapy, and although he's managed to gain control of his drinking, the memories linger. He still has nightmares about that scene, the flies, the rotting bodies, and most of all, the baby. In his dreams, the baby is still crying, calling out to him from the darkness. The night air was cold and crisp as I drove along the quiet highway, my headlights slicing through the darkness. The drive from the city had been long, but it was always worth it. I loved the peace and solitude of the little house I rented on the outskirts of town, miles away from the hustle and bustle of the city. I was looking forward to a quiet weekend, free from emails, phone calls, and constant noise. I could almost taste the freedom. As I pulled into the driveway, I glanced at the clock just past midnight. The house looked exactly as I remembered, peaceful and still. I had just finished unloading the car when I noticed the headlights of another vehicle pulling up behind me. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. There were no other houses around for miles, so the only reason anyone would be here this late was if they were lost or had a legitimate reason to stop. I turned toward the headlights, squinting against the harsh glare. A man stepped out of the vehicle, dressed in a dark uniform. At first, I assumed he might be a delivery driver or a service worker, but something about the way he moved made my instincts flare. His posture was too rigid, and his steps too calculated. He didn't seem like someone who had just driven up to help me with something. He approached cautiously, not in a hurried way, but with a deliberate pace. I took a step back, feeling a cold chill despite the warm air around me. "Can I help you?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. There was something about his gaze, something unnerving. "Good evening, ma'am," he said smoothly, his voice deep but not threatening. "I'm Officer Stevens with the local police department. We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area, and I'm just checking in on everyone." "Suspicious activity?" I echoed, trying to mask the unease creeping up my spine. There was no sign of anything unusual around here. "I haven't seen anything out of the ordinary." He nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. "Yes, ma'am. It's been a quiet night for the most part, but we've been told that someone might be in the area causing some trouble." He paused and stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I'd just like to verify that everything is all right here." I couldn't help but feel like something was off. "I'm fine," I said, my voice a little more clipped now. "Thank you for checking in, but I'm not having any issues." He ignored my attempt to end the conversation. "I understand, but for safety reasons, I'd like to take a quick look around your property. It won't take long." A wave of alarm washed over me, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. Why would a police officer need to search my property? There were no signs of anything being wrong here. I had never heard of this kind of thing happening before. "I'm sorry, but I don't feel comfortable with that," I said, my voice steady but firm. "If you're really a cop, you'll have a badge and some identification. Can I see that?" The man's expression didn't change, but there was a brief flash of hesitation before he straightened up. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I don't have my badge on me tonight, but I assure you, I'm an officer. My vehicle's right there." He gestured toward the car behind him. "You can call the station if you like." Now, I was really suspicious. Why would an officer not have his badge with him? This wasn't adding up. I kept my distance, my instincts telling me that something wasn't right. "I'd like to see your badge number before I let you on my property," I said, holding my ground. The man's eyes narrowed, and I could tell he was growing frustrated. "I told you, I'm with the police. This is important. Now, I need to look around." "No," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "I'm not letting anyone on my property without proper identification. I don't care if you're a cop or not. I need to see some ID." The man's lips curled into a tight smile. He wasn't happy, but he wasn't backing down. "Ma'am, if you're going to be difficult, I'll have to report this. You don't want to make things harder for yourself." I took a step back, suddenly aware of how exposed I was standing outside. I started to feel trapped, like I was in the middle of a game where the rules weren't clear. "I'm not making anything harder. I'm just asking to see some proof that you're who you say you are." There was a long pause as he studied me. For a moment, I thought he might just walk away, but instead, his voice dropped to a more menacing tone. "You've made a mistake," he said coldly, stepping forward again. I backed away quickly, heart racing. I had no idea what this man's intentions were, but I knew I couldn't let him get any closer. My fingers fumbled for my phone in my pocket as he kept moving toward me. "I'm calling the police," I shouted, hoping that would make him back off. To my surprise, the man didn't hesitate. Instead, he suddenly lunged for my phone. I barely managed to yank it from my pocket in time, slamming the door shut behind me as I stumbled backward into the house. My breath was coming in short bursts, adrenaline surging through my body. What the hell was going on? I locked the door, my mind spinning. I couldn't call the police, he had already taken my phone. But somehow, I knew I couldn't just sit here and wait. This man, this supposed officer, wasn't who he claimed to be, and I needed to get out of there. I ran to the back of the house, my heart hammering in my chest as I tried to think of my next move. My mind raced through every possible option. Should I call 911 from a landline? Should I try to get to a neighbor's house? But there was no one for miles. Suddenly, I heard a loud knock on the front door. I froze. "Ma'am?" The man called out in that same calm, almost mechanical voice. "You're making a big mistake. Open the door." His voice had changed, less friendly, more demanding. The calm demeanor was gone. I knew I had to act fast. I grabbed the phone from the table and quickly dialed 911, barely able to speak through my fear. "There's a man outside pretending to be a cop. I don't know what he wants, but I think he's dangerous." The dispatcher's voice came through clear, calm, and reassuring. "We've got officers on the way. Stay inside and lock all doors and windows." I nodded, my fingers trembling. There was no time to waste. The man was still outside, his voice growing more frantic now. "You can't hide from me," he shouted. "You'll regret this." I moved quietly through the house, making sure to stay out of sight. Every footstep, every creak of the floorboards made my stomach lurch. The seconds dragged on as I waited for the police to arrive. I could hear his movements outside, getting closer, his voice still echoing in the night air. Finally, I heard sirens. The man's voice stopped abruptly, followed by the sound of footsteps retreating into the darkness. I knew he wasn't gone, but the police had arrived, and that was all that mattered.